without further ado, I would like to introduce, are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay, we're going first. Katherine Rand with the D, the poster. Unfortunately, the poster had to go to print within 24 hours because our graphic artist was leaving the university to go freelance. So it perhaps did not get the thorough editing that it required. But this is Katherine Rand, and she's a classmate of mine at Claremont School of Theology in the Practical Theology Spiritual Care and Counseling PhD program. So please give her a warm welcome.
I have a feeling that my throat, I'm going to have to be clearing it a bunch, so I apologize for that. So, thank you, Holly. It's really great hearing about your practice and your chaplaincy. My path has been a little bit different, and I'm going to, I hope it's okay for me to take a little bit of time to give you some biographical information because I think it's important to the subject at hand. So, first of all, I was born into a particular Episcopalian family, secular Christian, but had a very strong cultural identity as Episcopalians. Now, a lot of people aren't familiar with this idea of being culturally Christian, though they might be familiar with cultural Jews or secular Jews. But it's definitely a real phenomenon, and that's the culture that I was brought up in. Now, at the same time, my mother's father was a theologian, divinity school professor, and also an Episcopalian Episcopal minister. And yet he was actually a really radical theologian. So in the sense that he taught us that the Bible was literature, not the Word of God, that God exists in relationship as opposed to being some being, more like maybe interdependence. So that's the environment that I come from. So unlike some people who are drawn to Buddhism, who come from a Jewish or Christian upbringing, I never really felt like I had much to reject, per se. But the sacred stories, the myths, the symbols didn't really resonate for me very strongly. And I was always kind of a contemplative nature. I grew up in the middle of the woods. I spent a lot of time alone. I was a youngest child, and my sister and brother were quite a bit older. And I picked up my first book on Buddhism when I was 14, and I didn't really have any kind of role models or anyone to guide me, but I found my way, and I studied religion in undergrad, and I focused on East Asian Buddhism mostly, a little bit of Taoism. And so then I went on from there to actually get, most of my practice has been in the Theravadan tradition, but I feel very much shaped by both Zen and Jodo Shinshu because of the teachers that I've had along the way. And philosophically, I'm much more of a sort of non-dual bent. So, I have a kind of a mystic side to me at the same time as I'm very pragmatic, and, I have a real skeptical mind too. So I'm kind of a mix in terms of my own orientation. And I resist calling myself a Buddhist for all sorts of reasons. But there's no doubt, I've had a deep study and practice of Buddhism for over 20 years. So it's a huge part of who I am. But I also recognize that I've been deeply shaped by Christianity and other traditions as well. So that's where I'm coming from. And then in terms of how I made my way into chaplaincy, I think after I graduated from undergrad, I always felt drawn to some sort of ministry, but because I didn't have a really clear religious identity, there was no obvious place for me to go, no obvious congregation, nothing. And chaplaincy didn't really occur to me at the time. But one of my early mentors who had practiced in the insight meditation Vipassana tradition, she was a longtime hospice volunteer, and she inspired me to train as a hospice volunteer. And so that was sort of my initial entry into spiritual caregiving. And then I got involved in a career in government, IT and operations. I didn't really get to do much in the way of caregiving. And eventually, when I realized that I was not happy with what I was doing because I was not tending to my emotional and spiritual life in my work, and I really wanted it to be integrated, I went back to hospice and eventually found my way to the New York Zen Center for Contemplative Care and did their year-long training, which it's called the Foundation in Contemplative Care. They basically don't think anyone should do CPE, clinical pastoral education, without having had a little bit of a go at it. So this foundation is meant to kind of vet people to see if they're up to snuff, more or less, because CPE is really hard work. So it's kind of an interesting concept because we don't have a pre-CPE year in the standard CPE pedagogy. But so that was great because I was already working in a skilled nursing facility with people as a hospice volunteer, and I just kind of parlayed that into becoming a contemplative or pastoral volunteer. And so I did about 100 hours there while I was training with them. And if anyone's interested, I'm happy to, I know one person has expressed interest in learning more about my time and my training with them. I'd be happy to talk afterwards. But so after that, then I realized I was really kind of hooked, and so I went straight into doing an intensive, summer internship, CPE in the more traditional program. I went to an urban hospital in Connecticut. That's where I'm from, and loved it. And my experience was quite similar to Holly's there, where I was the only chaplain on call overnight on the weekend, and I'd have 9 deaths in a day, at least on one of the worst days. And so it's just one crisis trauma, from one to the next, and really intense experience. My time now, I am continuing on with my CPE at Cedars-Sinai, which is also a very large urban hospital, and level 1 trauma center, but it doesn't have the same feel. I mean, I had a lot of gunshot wound victims in Hartford. Here in Beverly Hills, West Hollywood, it's not really like that. And we don't have, the model there is a little different, so we don't do overnight on calls. And the hospital culture is not used to having students, chaplaincy students there, and they're not used to calling people or calling spiritual care when someone dies, for example, whereas in my other hospital, if there's a death, chaplain's called. Chaplain comes no matter what, regardless of whether the patient's asked for it. In Cedars-Sinai, it's quite different. They have a person whose dedicated job is to deal with after-death care, and chaplains aren't really a part of that. So it's a different experience. It works well since I'm in school right now. I prefer not to have quite the same intensity, so it's good. But in any case, also Cedars is interesting because it's a Jewish hospital, and actually 20% of their census is Jewish. So I was really excited to get more experience working with Jewish patients, and haven't really had that much experience with Jewish patients because Jewish patients really prefer Jewish chaplains. And while I can very much pass as a Christian chaplain, I don't do a very good job passing as a Jewish chaplain. My sister's Jewish, but that doesn't work. So, in any case, but this whole idea of pastoral authority and, what Holly talked about, how important is my Buddhist identity? Well, in my case, that's a whole other thing, because I haven't quite fully come to a place where I can really just say, okay, this is what I am, because I am many things. And so, depending on the context, I might change according to the needs. This can be a real asset. It can also be a very big limitation. But yeah, this idea of being authentic and being true to what we believe when we walk into the room and someone expects a certain kind of care, and we have to respond in a way that is honest to who we are and what we believe and what our practice is, but we also have to be able to honor and respect the unique language, symbols, meaning making of the person that we're caring for. So I wanted to talk a little bit specifically about prayer. Reason being, it is an extremely important spiritual tool in especially in an interfaith, hospital chaplaincy context. And I don't happen to have too much of a problem with prayer, even if I'm using words that don't really match exactly my spiritual life, but I know a lot of people do. So I wanted to talk about that. And I also want to talk about why it's not really a problem for me. I mean, in the sense that, let's see. I guess for me, prayer is not a part of my personal spiritual practice, really at all. There have been a number of occasions in my life where spontaneously I have been moved to prayer. But I grew up with a very formal kind of prayer, where you read out of a book, call and response, really boring, nothing inspirational about it whatsoever. And that never did anything for me. A lot of Christians especially, which is definitely the majority of the patients that I see, somewhere on the spectrum, they could be totally very loosely religious, they could be evangelical, it runs the whole gamut. But for them, spontaneous prayer is something that's familiar and common. And so I have learned that that's a really important part of my spiritual care practice, is being able to provide spontaneous prayer when I visit patients. Now, one of my worst nightmares is if I walk in the room and the person says, "Oh, chaplain, I'm so glad you arrived. Can I have a prayer?" That's not really what I'm talking about. Prayer for me is something that emerges organically after I have really gotten to know somebody and made a connection, and it tends to be a reflection of my listening. It's, I have heard you. I have heard what your deepest needs are. I have heard what your fears are. I have heard what your hopes are. And I want you to know that you've truly been heard. And that's what prayer is for me. Sometimes the visit itself is prayer, and it's enough. But other times, it's really important to actually give voice to this sense of, we've connected, I've heard you. And I feel compassion. So that's how I understand prayer. I think probably a lot of us have ideas about what prayer is, and especially in a Christian context. You might say, well, we don't have prayer in Buddhism. I don't agree with that. I think we have lots of prayer, and not necessarily exactly how I just described what prayer is for me generally in my chaplaincy work. But I'd like to suggest that, for example, just the fact that gasho, or putting our hands together, is the exact same, physical gesture that people do when they're talking about Christian prayer. So I don't think it's just totally accident that this putting our hands together, which can mean I dedicate, it can mean I thank you, I am so grateful, it can mean may this be so, it can mean all these things. These are all prayers. Bowing, which is huge in the Vajrayana tradition, prostrations. It's an important part of the Theravada tradition. It's a very important part of Jodo Shinshu. Bowing, too, is a form of humbling, and it is a form of expressing gratitude. This is prayer. So I also think vows, intentions, all of these things are prayers. Chanting is prayer. When we do metta practice, clearly that's prayer. So there are many ways in which we do engage in prayer. Not everybody uses all of these practices. Maybe some of you don't engage in any of them, but trying to suggest that there may be aspects of your spiritual practice that you can connect with the concept of prayer that could be helpful for you if you're ever doing this kind of work. So, let's see, I've been kind of winging it and haven't even been looking at my notes. So, one other just example of prayer that I wanted to share is meal prayers before you're eating. This is something that in my spiritual communities is very common. And I'm going to just read you one, for example. This is in Burma, where I spent a lot of time doing intensive practice. We would say at the beginning of every meal, I eat this food only to preserve life and to remain healthy, knowing that it is only to study and practice. Therefore, I will use 4 requisites: food, clothes, accommodation, and medicine. May all yogis, that is, people who are engaged in the practice of meditation, be healthy, live a long life, and be free from danger. May they accomplish what they want. May all people who donated this food be healthy, live a long life, and be free from danger. May they accomplish what they want. Very simple, definitely a prayer. So, I think there are many examples of how we do use prayer. So I also want to reference a couple of, probably many of you have read or looked at The Arts of Contemplative Care, that book. There are 2 entries in there, 2 essays in there in particular that I thought were really helpful around this subject. And One is from Wako Shannon Hickey, who is a religion professor and trained at GTU in both theology and religion. She's also worked as a chaplain, and she writes this chapter called Meditation is Not Enough. And in it, she talks about offering a prayer to a Jehovah's Witness patient who is bleeding out in the emergency room. And if you know anything about Jehovah's Witnesses, they believe that blood transfusions are not okay. So this guy could live, but he's not going to because of the beliefs. So in that situation, you gotta just do whatever you can. The wife of the patient asks for prayer, and Hickey writes, she asked me to pray, but in my Zendo, we never do extemporaneous prayer. From somewhere beyond me, a prayer to Jehovah emerges from my lips. The moment I stop speaking, the man flatlines. From somewhere beyond me. When I engage in prayer, that it's coming from some really deeply grounded place where I am truly connecting with another human being, and I'm truly understanding the nature of their defense. It can't be forced. And that can be a problem. Like when I go to a fetal demise and the person's like, you need to pray for these babies. The babies are in another room. The babies are dead. I can't pray for something that's dead because prayer comes alive for me in relationship. But I have to find a way. So I try and understand what the nurses who are there with me need, and what are their beliefs, and how do I honor that, and somehow ritualize this really, really sad moment. Mark Power is a board-certified chaplain and palliative care consultant at Seattle Children's Hospital, and he writes another chapter which is really, really helpful about caregiving in a Christian context. So, if you don't mind, I'm going to read a passage because I think it's really helpful. So he says, with the pastoral relationship, there's the potential for an exchange that allows for spiritual healing. In the current culture, here in the U.S., defined mostly by Judeo-Christian beliefs and practices, prayer is the substance of that exchange. One could say that prayer is the currency of ministry. For that reason, it was necessary for me to learn the language and etiquette of prayer. Not surprisingly, this added another layer of challenge to my training, he says. My non-theistic beliefs were threatened, and I felt deep resistance to calling on the Lord in prayer. I struggled with this daily. What I noticed was that when I relaxed, there were times when prayer was effortless and inspired. And at other times, when I was fearful or uptight, my experience felt empty and hypocritical. I would swing back and forth from an effortless connection to painful resistance. This dynamic was persistent enough that I felt the need for some kind of clarification from my Buddhist teachers. In truth, what I wanted was not clarification, but permission to stop the practice of prayer on religious grounds. I wanted my teachers to confirm my feelings of discomfort as intelligence directing me away from a theistic pitfall and to permit me to discontinue prayer. But when he talks with his teachers, he's hoping for a pass, No, you shouldn't pray with Christians. After all, you're Buddhist. We don't share their belief in God. However, that was not the response I received. I was surprised by the consistency of the message I received from each of the masters I consulted. We pray. They, Christians, pray. There's not much difference, huh? When you pray to God, imagine Amitabha, the Buddha of boundless light. I wasn't given any support for my resistance. He says then, in discussing the concerns and startled reactions of friends, spiritual friends, other Buddhists, Power says that the reactions actually helped him to see how concepts were a distraction from addressing hidden fears. This recognition prompted further exploration into the question of pastoral identity. So what is it that causes us to feel a resistance when it comes to prayer. I think the God concept is a pretty big one. So, I guess I'm just going to put the question out there, like, what would it be like to drop that concept? Not worry about it. So if the patient wants to speak to God, wants to raise their prayer to God, is that okay? Can you say that and still be very much respecting your own beliefs? Can you replace God in your mind with, Amida, Buddha, or with interdependence, or with Dhamma, or whatever it is that is most sacred to you as a concept? They're just concepts. They're just words. But if we can do that, it allows for really deep, meaningful connection with another person. There's so many times when after I have provided a prayer, the person says, I've never felt so heard in my life. Or I'll come back after a visit in which there was a really meaningful prayer, and I'll say, oh gosh, I've been fine ever since then. I mean, it's not always going to happen that way, but it does sometimes have just incredibly therapeutic potential. So, I encourage you to find ways to explore possibly bringing prayer into your spiritual care. Let's see, how am I doing on time? So let's see. What do you guys? Would you guys like to hear like another personal example or something like that? Okay. So I had this one in my first unit of CPE. I had this patient that I saw. This is very unusual. I saw him 1 or 2 times a week over a period of about 6 weeks. And he was a young man who, he was exactly my age. And he was hospitalized due to liver failure as a result of binge drinking for about 2.5, 3 months straight. And that's one of those diagnoses is that I just have a really hard time with, because it's like, really, this is so unnecessary. You're a totally healthy, young person, and you're killing yourself. And in this case, it was too late. He had done too much damage, and we have a total organ shortage in this country, and so people who need organs because of self-harm, because of addiction, have to be sober for 6 months before they can get even on the transplant list. He wasn't going to make it 6 months. So I had a lot of learning to do in this relationship, because I became very attached to him and to him somehow surviving, getting a second chance. Part of that is because of my own relationships with addicts and my own substance abuse in the past, and just really caring a lot about somebody having a second chance. And so learned all sorts of things about like boundaries in a spiritual caregiving relationship over this time. And he was Indian born and fairly atheistic, though he was raised in a kind of in a Hindu culture. So he had sort of, I mean, he was, on the chart he was listed as Hindu, but he wasn't really very religious. So I struggled with kind of how to honor him as both an atheist and as a cultural Hindu. And I found myself at a certain point, I realized that I was praying for him in my, mind. I would wake up in the morning, I would be thinking of him. Boundaries. And I was really, really hoping he was going to make it somehow. So I was doing this for weeks, but I never ever once offered him a prayer. Well, why not? Well, because it didn't seem appropriate, because it wasn't something he was asking for, because it's not really part of my own spiritual practice. But there I was, starting to pray for this guy in my own heart and mind. So at some point I decided, what the heck, I need to give it a go. So anyway, this is sort of a little poetic version of it, that for my evaluation when I was doing my CBE unit, we had like a creative exercise we had to do for the evaluation. So I wrote this little thing called prayer. So this is more or less the encounter. Then I asked if I could say a prayer. Startled, he said, "Why would you even ask?" So I proceeded. Placing the heart's full attention on all that is good and right in the world, I ask that you be healed in body, mind, and heart. That you may use this pain and suffering as an opportunity to grow, that you may fully awaken to your true self and find a peace like no other. At the end, he thanked me, asking, "Why would anyone reject it?" And I turned my head and cried. Moving to another encounter. "Be still and know that I am the Lord," she said, quoting Psalm 46. Be still and know that I am. With tears in her eyes, she told me she loved me. I held her hand and thanked God, Lord Jesus, for the gift of our communion. And then the last one is a little bit more lighthearted, if I can find it. I don't know where it is, but anyway. So an encounter with a Baptist who I ended up actually saying that I was Buddhist in that encounter for whatever reason. And he said, "But you're not bald or wearing an orange robe." And we laughed together. That too was a prayer. So let's see. I don't know. I'm sort of wandering a lot here. I know what I haven't said, which I really, if I'd had a whiteboard, if I'd had a whiteboard, I would have done this, but. So Thich Nhat Hanh has a little book called The Energy of Prayer, which you may or may not have read. And there's one thing in there that is particularly relevant to what I'm talking about. And so, to try and imagine. So I think a lot of people, when they think of prayer, they think of it as intercessory prayer. In other words, I'm asking for something so that you might, you being God, might give me something. And that's problematic, especially for a non-theist. So, in that kind of model, you have the chaplain who's like person A, you have the patient who's person B, and then you have God up here, and there's an arrow going up to God and then coming down to the patient, right? So that's not the model we're talking about here. The model we're talking about here is one big circle, and we're all in it. A, B, God. it's very different. So I find that helpful. Yeah, I think that I'm going to end on that. I had sort of a prayer for prayer, which I could read, but I don't know. I'm sort of feeling like that's enough. And I thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share this with you and to be here with you. Thank you, Monica, and everyone else for making this possible.
So I'm going to ask Holly to come back up, and we're going to have a little question and answers. So we are recording this because several people out there in internet land who could not fly all the way to Los Angeles, don't ask me why, for this gathering, are very interested actually in what's going on here. So we're going to have some question and answer. And I'm going to hand this mic back to our hospital chaplains, and I'm going to get the other mic. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and I will bring you the microphone. And you can ask your question, and you two can fight over who answers it in the nicest way possible. I hope.
I also have a specific question for one.
Yes, if you have a specific question for one or the other, please do say. But we just want to get your question so that the people in internet land can hear it. And so that we can all hear it. Does that sound good?
Turning this one on is a trick. There we go.
Okay. Questions?
I have a question. My question is for you. I'm sorry, I forget your name.
Catherine?
Yes. I'm in the Buddhist Chaplaincy program here. I also, like you, don't strictly identify as Buddhist. So I wonder how you've handled that in applying for CPE, all of this stuff. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a good, really practical question. So far, it has not been a hindrance in any way, shape, or form in the sort of application process, either to hospitals or to my theology program. I mean, I did have to do a little bit of wrangling in order to say, at least with Claremont School of Theology, in the sense that it's like I don't have the same training that they've always expected from PhD students. I don't have an MDiv. I have a master's in public policy, but I also have a lot of practical experience and self-study of Buddhism. So as far as I needed to be clear on that, and I think that regardless of I believe that we are all multiple in some way or another. And I think that unfortunately in a Western, very binary kind of way of thinking, people resist the idea of us being hybrid, multiple, complex, ambiguous in some way or another, especially when we're talking about religious identity. And, especially in the academy, there's a lot of people really denigrate multiplicity and, call it syncretism. And syncretism is like a dirty word. We are up against challenges in that respect. And in terms of if you're pursuing professional chaplaincy and you want to be board certified, particularly through APC or BCCI, APC is the Association of Professional Chaplains, they're sticklers, and it's tough. But Mark Power, who I read that passage from, he's board certified, and he demonstrated educational equivalency. So even without an MDiv, he was able to say, look, my training is is sufficient, and more than, far more than sufficient. But it's hard to do that, and so fortunately we have Buddhist chaplains who are board certified who have been able to demonstrate that they are well trained, and APC has been willing to give them the board certification. So I do have the intention to be board certified, and I haven't figured out how that's going to happen because I don't have an MDiv, and I'm going, I have the PhD, but it's not the exact curriculum they're looking for, and it's not enough credits, and so I'm going to have to find some way to make it work, and I'm just kind of operating on faith that I will be able to, because it's worked out for me so far. And one of a really moving experience that I had in CPE was that one of my peers, who's an Orthodox rabbi, originally really challenged me about my religious identity and my beliefs, like in a very Talmudic style, like argumentative, like, prove to me how you believe blah, 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 and how that works for you, and, how it's internally consistent, and da, 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 da. And I felt totally attacked, and I was like, oh my God, I can't believe I have to justify my right to exist, to be who I am. But then during the midterm evaluation, he told me that he thought that I had the deepest theology of anyone he knew. I cried, but I'm not like a big crier, but I was like, whoa, I was not expecting that. But this is one reason that I really, really, really value CPE, is it allows for that kind of learning to happen, like where people can really challenge their assumptions and learn from one another in a way that just doesn't happen elsewhere. So I really, if you haven't noticed, I really value interreligious education, and partly because I consider myself interreligious. I am religiously plural, and I live in a society that's religiously plural, so that's how I, operate. So I don't know if I have to.
Yeah, thank you.
Just a quick comment in response to Yasha's question and your response. It's great that you use the example of Mark and Jennifer Block and some other folks who've been board certified, who've kind of gone a very non-traditional route that way. I had a thought too. Not long ago, I was trying to help a student who was in a kind of unusual predicament with thinking about how to apply for board certification. And one of the places my brain went to and kind of looking at it with the student was saying, how do Quakers figure this out? And lo and behold, there was an APC policy written for Quakers that showed, I think, a lot of thought in terms of integrity for the APC and integrity for the tradition of Quakerism. And I've kind of been thinking a lot about that policy since I read it and its possible applications for Buddhists or people of multiplicity of traditions. But I think it's a nice touchstone in terms of how they, I think, approached a tradition in all seriousness, trying to understand its particular contours and flavors and so forth, and kind of figured it out in a way that, as an outsider, I looked at it and I said, this seems to make sense. I might want to ask some Quakers what they think about that. But it seems like tucked away in a lot of paperwork, there are these interesting policies that other people have used to figure things out. And I think for Buddhists, for people of multiple faith backgrounds, there's a lot of usefulness in sort of digging out some of these and finding those. So for whatever it's worth, I think there's a paper trail that might be helpful.
Thanks.
Also to respond, I'm a BCC, and I've also sat in a meeting to certify other people. And I can say that as far as education, MDiv, I think they have ways to find equivalents. But they are real strict about you being endorsed by some kind of religious body. So if you are not affiliated with any particular endorsing body, then they have a hard time accepting. But as far as education, I think they can make all kinds of equivalents.
Catherine, thank you for talking about prayer. Because you know,
Noriko inspired me.
because I'm one of the people who have problems with prayers. I did my first unit of CPE last year, and I'm a volunteer chaplain at Shock Hospital in San Diego. And last Friday it happened again. I said, I'm a chaplain, and the patient said, okay, say a prayer. So I'm like, oh no. And then I did the only prayer that I have for Christian patients that's kind of fake. So whenever I pray, I feel so fake, because for Christian patients, I feel like I have to say a Christian prayer. So I say God and all that, and it makes me very uncomfortable. So I know it's not good, but I do it because I don't know any other way, so I haven't found it. And after I said a prayer, I asked him if there's anything else I can do, and he said, no, that's it. So that does happen, and I can't make there's no room to make connection. What do you do for cases like that? It happens a lot.
Well, I just want to say that I can't do that kind of prayer either. And so when I walk into a room and someone immediately asks for a prayer, one thing to keep in mind is that sometimes you've sort of been set up because, the nurse is like, oh, let me, you want a prayer? You want a chaplain? Oh, let me get the chaplain to provide a prayer for you. It's sort of that kind of thing happens. So there's an educational piece that has to happen systemically, that's not really what chaplaincy is. It's one tool that's used in chaplaincy. So when someone says that to me, I usually say, well, I'd be happy to offer you a prayer, but it'd really be great to get to know you a little bit first. Can you tell me about how your day's going? What's going on? Whatever, just the normal intervention, you kind of divert. And if there's no response, because there are obviously those kinds of patients who just aren't going to be open and aren't really interested in making a connection, then, you can always defer to your Christian colleague. You can always say, okay, well, I'm here if you want to talk, and, I can provide this, but, if you'd like a prayer, let me see if my Christian colleague can come and provide that for you. It might be better. I think that it really depends on the situation, but I would never advocate you doing something that feels like makes your stomach sick, makes you really feel like you're being dishonest or just feels yuck. And I've done it before, and I don't like it. I speak Spanish, and I'm one of the only people who speak Spanish in my hospital, so sometimes I get called, and it's a lot of Pentecostal patients, and sometimes Catholics is easier for me to deal with. And then I don't mind so much because I can't do spontaneous prayer very easily in Spanish. It's just not, I haven't formed that language. I need more practice. So I don't mind actually reading something in that case, because if it's going to be meaningful for them, I'm still going to try and have conversation and make connection and really figure out what's going on. So because that for me is what makes a prayer authentic, is so.
Yeah, I definitely those ways of responding, and also the For me, something that tends to happen is I walk into a room and someone says something like that, and I immediately assume things about them. And like, I love your point about being multiple. And I honestly think everybody has these multiple streams of influence, whether they identify as this religion or that religion, or multiple religions, or no faith, or, you know, all of these different ways can sometimes be very helpful and can get in the way. So when I walk into a room and someone says something like that, and maybe I have a reaction, like, oh no, do I have to use God language? Are they this faith? I've been through this before. You know, whatever it provokes in me can be a cue that I need to look more closely. You know, what are the multiple things going on in their life? Who are they actually? And yes, of course, there are going to be situations where you're asked to do something you're not comfortable doing, and referring or offering what you can offer, those things. But yeah, I think that there's a little element of, you know, on the one hand, it's true that we have religious differences, and there's conflict that comes from that, and discomfort, and boundaries around what I can do and can't do with integrity. And then on the other hand, there's the kind of feeling I get in chaplaincy of we're all in it together, and never losing sight of that part. You know, every time I walk into someone's room, they're a unique person. They're not just a Christian. They're not just a Buddhist. They're not just a, however they're identifying. Yeah.
Any more questions?
Hi. This is a comment rather than a question, but this really important conversation reminds me of the concept of non-attachment to views, and may be helpful use of a word.
Yeah, that was one of my questions, you know, at the end of my presentation, about this living question I'm wrestling with, about when to claim an identity and why and what purpose that serves, and what's at stake if I don't. And I think for me, the identifying as a Buddhist is it's so important for me because I need that in order to be a chaplain. I need these religious resources. So it's like I need to identify as a Buddhist because I'm not enlightened yet. I don't know why. I wish I didn't have to.
Other questions? Okay. I'm gonna come back to you.
Yeah, my question goes to Holly. And you mentioned about when a patient asks you, are you Buddhist? And then there's a sudden silence. And that also happened to me sometimes when I give a double talk at service, and some soldiers come up to me and they know I'm a Buddhist chaplain. And suddenly just, most of them are nice, but sometimes you can see somebody don't want to talk to you. That happens. And in your case, how do you deal with that when there's a silence or people just don't want to talk to you? How do you deal with that?
I still don't have a good, a satisfying way for myself, because it feels like in those moments, what I'm offering, they can't accept. So how can we eat together? You know, ways. Usually, as you said, there's ways of asking, so how's your day, or continuing a relationship, rather than maybe getting fixated on things they said or ideas. But when that doesn't work, often if I need to leave, either because they ask me to or because we can't actually continue an empathic relationship, I'll leave kindly. So it was good to meet with you. There are other chaplains here. Would you like me to ask them to come and visit? Is there any other need that you have that I can relay to someone else? Simple things like, do you want water before I go? Do you want the door open or closed? So I just keep offering the kind of relationship that I can. And then it's up to them to respond as they will. And then in terms of like the self-care aspect of that, yeah, I definitely feel disappointed and even hurt sometimes. And for me, the way that I frame that currently is, it was nice that we had the karma to meet at all. And maybe another life we'll know each other better. So just like a seed. So just kind of being thankful for that. But there's no easy answer for that one for me.
I just wanted to add that I would say that my experience of rejection probably happens more frequently, and part of this is because I'm not in robes and I'm not obviously other. I can pass. But more often than not, the rejection comes because I'm chaplain. Period. So the fact that that's a loaded word and that people have all sorts of assumptions of what that means, and especially people who are of a more non-religious bent, that can be a real barrier, but not always. And as far as like my own religious identity being a barrier, this is something that I think we'll be working on for a long time, personally. It's, the thing that I struggle with is when someone's like, so what denomination are you? I'm like, oh God, that's a much longer story than, and it's an ongoing process and of sort of, how do I respond to these questions when people are kind of trying to figure out where I'm coming from and what authority I have as a religious leader, because as a chaplain you are a religious leader, even if you aren't from the same religious tradition. I think that what Holly says is part of it is recognizing that they're asking that question for a reason, that they're not just making small talk, that there's something that's causing them to sort of challenge us in terms of our authority on the matter. And authority is a terrible word, but it's what they use in CPE, pastoral authority. So I think it's something that we have to be very aware of in every encounter where identity comes up, or where patients are asking those kinds of questions, and what happens to us internally. Obviously, so much of this work is about that self-reflexive quality and the ability to really feel into what's going on in us internally when we're feeling rejection, resistance, fear, discomfort, whatever it is.
So, are you chaplain? Can you please do me a favor? I can fly back to my hometown next month. I don't want, this is I want is to go back to my hometown safe and come back to work safe. Please pray for me.
You're asking me first there, both of us?
Most of you.
Per person?
I know you are Buddhist chaplain, but I would like you, please pray for me.
So like what I was trying to describe is that, so much of what makes prayer come alive for me is in relationship, and being on display makes it a lot harder. And not really being able to have a deeper conversation with you to really, So I mean, I would probably resort to a more generic metta prayer in that case, wishing for your safety, your safe travel, your warm reunion with your family and whoever else is there. That you may be well, safe, and peaceful.
Another chaplain, please.
I'll pray with you in private, my friend.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, this is not my question. One is I was she is a lieutenant colonel, psychiatrist. She's gonna go back to visit her parents. She asked me. She exactly know I'm a Buddhist chaplain candidate in the unit, this army unit. We were together for over a year. But she asked me this question. So, if you would like to hear, I can share what I respond about that. First of all, I asked her back. Could you please tell me why you want me to pray for you? She told me, she said, I just had about Malaysia Airlines. I don't want this to happen to me. You know about that? Malaysia Airlines from Malaysia to Chinese, but it's not there. It's somewhere else. I don't know. It's until now. Nobody find, right? Yeah, and then another question I asked her, do you book a ticket? She said, yeah. Do you contact your parents? Yes. Do you have insurance in your ticket? Is some kind of like a cover if something happens? She said, yeah. Did you talk to your boss? If something happens, or if you cannot come back to work on time? She said, yeah. Did you talk to your family? You're gonna go, or someone is gonna go with you? She said, yeah, I did. I said, this communication is kind of prayer. You pray for yourself. Do you want me to pray for you again? She said, yeah. Okay. Do you love your parents? Yeah. Do you love your family? Yeah. Your family love you? Yes. She said. And I asked her again, I'm Buddhist. Can I ask you again? What's your denomination? She said she believes in God. That's why she asked me to pray. Because in the unit, we don't have a Christian chaplain, only Buddhist chaplain in the unit. She cannot ask any chaplain pray for her. And then at that time, I said, okay, to believe in God. Okay, as I heard from another chaplain, or that's what I learned, God loves people. You love God. Okay, I can pray for you. With power of God love, with power of your parent love you, with power of spiritual love. And don't forget, power of you love yourself, you will be saved. I guarantee. If you do not save, you will see me again. And then after that, I hold her hand. She said, thank you, Chaplain. So the one more question, I love when you talk. Both of you, how can you keep smiling in this crisis situation? Thank you.
It's probably the last question, yeah. So your question is, how do you smile after crisis situations? Or in,
When you face this situation like that.
when we're finished?
No, when you have to,
Faced.
yeah, you have to deal with a situation like okay, when you say people cry, you do
Yeah.
not cry before people.
I don't usually smile.
Well, I sometimes laugh with people. I sometimes cry with people. I'm human. But in terms of how do I keep going, which is sort of, I think, under the question, when you see a lot of sadness. I mean, an example of one of my worst, nightmares when it came true for me was a baby dead in the emergency room, and experiencing raw grief and having to stay with her for hours, while she held this dead baby in her arms. Horrible. Like, there's so totally nothing you can do other than just stay and be present with a person as you're experiencing that. But because in the end it's life-giving, this work.